I've told this story twice in my life. Once to a man from the university who drove up to my flat in Leeds and sat across my kitchen table with a cup of tea, going cold between his hands, and once to no one in particular, at 3 a.m, talking to the dark above my bed because sleep had stopped being something I could trust. Fee is the third time. I'm writing it down because the university man is dead. Coronary, they said, 6 months after our conversation, and because I'm 54 years old now, and the thing I carried back from the ice is still in a fireproof lockbox under my floorboards, and sooner or later, someone else is going to need to know. My name is Stan Walsh. In the autumn of 1992, Miskatonic University hired me to go to Antarctica and retrieve research materials from an expedition that had stopped reporting in. I want to be clear about what I was at the time. I was not a scientist. I had a geology certificate from a polytechnic that no longer exists, 8 years of commercial drilling work across 3 continents, and a reputation for being the kind of man who finished jobs that other men had walked away from. The university wanted someone who could operate alone in extreme cold, navigate by compass and dead reckoning, and not panic if things got strange. They had already lost 4 researchers. They were no longer sending academics. They told me the expedition had gone down to study ice core data and atmospheric carbon. Climate work. The world was waking up to what the ice could tell us. And Miskatonic had a grant and a small camp and a team of 4. Nathan Pickman, the lead glaciologist. A technician named Bill, who I later learned everyone called just Bill. A doctoral student named Hargreaves, who I would never account for at all. And a postdoc named Reese, who had been Nathan's student, and was, according to the university liaison, a very serious young woman who kept meticulous records of everything. I remember the liaison. Thin man, glasses, the kind of academic administrator who has spent so long sitting on committees that all his edges have worn smooth. He handed me a folder of coordinates and told me the project was routine retrieval. Equipment, data, personnel, if any were recoverable. He said, if any were recoverable, the way a man says a sentence he has rehearsed to keep his voice level. And his voice remained level, but his hands didn't. I noted the hands and filed it, told me, and what he didn't tell me, filled the flight from Heathrow to Christchurch, and then the short hop to McMurdo in roughly equal proportion. He had told me the team's names, their roles, their last confirmed contact. 12 days prior, a brief check-in call that Nathan had kept to 90 seconds, which was shorter than his previous calls, and which the liaison had noted as unusual. He had told me the camp coordinates and the GPS waypoints for the primary drill site. He had not told me what the check-in call had contained, and when I'd pressed him, carefully, the way you press on something when you're not sure yet whether it will bear weight. He had looked at his folder and said that the call had been technically within normal parameters, which is a sentence designed to avoid saying what was actually said. I found out eventually, after everything, what Nathan had said in that 90-second check-in, 4 words that the liaison had not wanted to put in a briefing document. 4 words that explained why the university had hired a man with a geology certificate and a reputation for not panicking, rather than sending another set of researchers. Nathan had said, "We found something old, that was all." 90 seconds of call time, 4 words of content, and then the line had gone quiet and the expedition had stopped reporting. The camp was a 2-hour snowcat ride from the resupply depot at the edge of the shelf. I made it alone in weather that turned hard on the 2nd hour. The kind of Antarctic cold that isn't dramatic, isn't cinematic, just works at you steadily and seriously. The way a machine works, without malice and without mercy. Worked in Siberia and on the Tibetan Plateau and on rigs off the Newfoundland coast. An Antarctic cold in September is its own category. It has a quality of finality to it. It is the cold of a planet that existed long before us and does not particularly notice that we've arrived. I arrived to find the camp intact and the people gone. Not gone in the sense of fled. The snowcat was still parked in its shelter. Their personal gear was still in the sleeping quarters. Nathan's journal, a thick green hardback, was sitting open on his bunk, with his pen still clipped to the last page he'd written on. There were 4 mugs in the drying rack. The camp stove had burned itself out sometime in the previous 36 hours, and the interior temperature had dropped to something that preserved everything exactly as it had been left. like a diorama under glass. I walked through the sleeping quarters twice, checked the supply tent, confirmed that no note had been left anywhere that I could find. Then I did what I was hired to do. I got the stove going again, made myself tea, and sat down to read the journal. Then I found the camera. Nathan had been filming. Reese had been filming. Bill, apparently, had also been filming. He'd brought a personal camcorder because, as he explained in an early segment, he was building a documentary that would make him famous. He was cheerful about this. He said it with the absolute confidence of a man who has not yet been confronted with a particular scale of what he was standing next to. There were 11 tapes in a canvas bag under Nathan's bunk, numbered in black marker. Some were labeled, some weren't. I sat in that camp for 3 days and watched all of them on the small battery-powered playback unit they'd left behind, rewinding certain segments to watch again, pausing on others to write notes in the margin of the blank pages at the back of the university's intake folder. 3 days is a long time to spend alone in an Antarctic camp watching other people's final record of themselves. I don't recommend it as an experience, but I am glad, and have been glad every day since, that I did it. What was on those tapes needed someone to understand it. And I am stubborn by nature and thorough by training. And I did not leave until I understood as much of it as I could. I'm going to tell you what was on them as accurately as I can. Because the university man asked me once whether I thought the expedition team had been foolish, and I told him no. They were curious. There's a difference. Foolish people make bad decisions because they aren't paying attention. These 4 had paid more attention than anyone in human history had ever paid to what was down there. And it had cost them everything, and it had also, though they didn't live to know it, changed what humanity knew about its own world, and its own age, and its own place in the order of things that had existed on this planet before us. First 2 tapes were procedural. Camp setup, ice core extraction from a site roughly 3 kilometers south of the camp. Nathan narrated competently into the camera in the flat voice of a man who has spent too long writing grant proposals, and now formats even his spoken sentences like abstracts. He noted coordinates, sample depths, stratification data, temperature readings at various depths, comparative analysis with previous Antarctic core data from the Vostok project. He was thorough and a bit tedious, and I liked him immediately for it, the way you sometimes like people you've never met, because their particular kind of seriousness reminds you of a craft. Drilling is a craft. You do it right or you do it wrong, and doing it wrong has consequences. Nathan Pickman understood that principle and had applied it to science. He cared about getting it right. He also cared about his team. This came through in small things the way character comes through in small things when you watch enough footage of a person. He stopped the camera when Bill made a joke, because he was laughing and didn't want the narration to become unprofessional. But you could hear him. He asked Reese, off camera, whether she was warm enough, not once but several times across the first 2 tapes, with the patient repetition of a supervisor who knows his postdoc runs cold and will not admit it. He was underneath the grant proposal voice, a decent man doing something he genuinely loved, in a place he had wanted to reach his whole career. Tape 3 was where things changed. Nathan had gone deeper with the drill than the survey plan called for, because the core samples at depth had started showing something anomalous, a stratum that didn't match any geological record he had a reference for. He described it on camera in halting language, stopping himself twice to recalibrate, searching for vocabulary that was precise, without committing to conclusions he hadn't yet earned the right to draw. Material was not ice, not permafrost, not any sedimentary or igneous substrate he recognized. It was dark, almost black, and it had a regular structure that his instruments told him was natural. No tooling marks, no manufacturing signatures that any of his equipment could detect, but that his eyes kept reading as artificial, as if whatever it was had been laid down in courses, as if it had been built. He drilled 2 more cores. The material continued at depth. He took samples, labeled them carefully, sealed them in the protective cases with the practiced precision of someone who knows that the sample is worthless if the provenance documentation isn't perfect. He noted in his narration that he was going to run spectrometric analysis that evening, and would have preliminary results by morning. He did not tell anyone outside the camp because he was, at that point, being scientifically careful. He wanted data before he said the word that was forming in the back of his mind, and that he was clearly, visibly suppressing. You could see the effort of it in his face on the camera. The way a man's jaw tightens when he is keeping a door closed by force. Tape 4 was Reese. She had found a surface feature about half a kilometer from the drill site. A slight depression in the ice shelf that her instruments showed was hollow beneath. Crevasse. The geometry was wrong for a crevasse. Not a pressure ridge artifact. A space. A large space, with dimensions that her equipment read as rectangular, rather than the irregular shapes that natural voids produce. She was calm on camera. She was the calmest person in all 11 tapes, right up until the last one she appeared in, and even then her voice did not crack the way Bill's did. She reported the hollow space the way you'd report a broken thermostat. Something to be fixed, something that had a cause that could be found if you approached it correctly. She was 26 years old in those tapes, and she moved through the world with the practical confidence of someone who has never yet encountered a problem that patience and rigor couldn't eventually resolve. She and Nathan went down together on the 5th day. Bill filmed their descent. They rigged a rope line into a natural fissure at the edge of the depression, a gap in the ice shelf roughly 1.5 meters wide, running down at an angle that eased into something nearly vertical after the first few meters. They went down in harnesses, Neth first, Reese following, with proper technique and proper equipment, and the kind of unhurried competence that comes from people who have done field work in dangerous places before and have learned that rushing is the beginning of the chain that ends badly. Bill called encouragement from above. Bill was always calling encouragement. It was his primary mode of interaction with a world that he clearly found more interesting than frightening. Right up until the point that he reconsidered. They were down for 4 hours. When they came back up, they didn't speak for a long time. Bill kept the camera running because he was, as he'd said, making a documentary, and documentary-making instinct overrides social instinct in certain kinds of people. He pointed the camera at their faces and let the silence accumulate. Nathan's face was the one I kept coming back to, on the playback, rewinding and watching again, not because it showed fear, but because it showed a specific kind of cognitive recalibration. The face of a man who has just been required to move a very large piece of furniture in his mind to make room for a new fact. One through fact. Many. The furniture is a lifetime of assumptions about the age of civilization, the uniqueness of intelligence, the significance of the human span in geological time. Moving, it is not a quick process. Nathan was reorganizing. You could watch it happening. Looked at the horizon and breathed with the slow deliberateness of someone choosing not to think about a thing until they were ready. When she was ready, she would think about it clearly and completely. That was her method. That had always been her method, I guessed. From the moment she'd understood that having a method was necessary. There are buildings down there, Nathan said eventually. Bill didn't say anything. Structures, Nathan corrected himself. Not buildings, structures. The word buildings implies. He stopped. He was going to say the word human, and the word was causing him difficulty in this context. Structures. Large ones. They extend further than our lights reached. How old? Bill said. Very old, Nathan said. The ice over the entrance passage. The ice we climbed through, there are pollen samples in the stratification layers that would put that ice at somewhere between 30 and 50 million years. If the entrance was sealed when that ice formed, then the structures are at least that old, Reese said. Older, Nathan said. The structures are older than the ice that sealed them. I've thought about that moment a great deal, in the years since, 30 to 50 million years. To put a scale on that, the genus that would eventually produce human beings didn't appear until roughly 6 million years ago. Our earliest recognizable ancestors, upright, tool-using, social, go back perhaps 3 million. The first evidence of organized human settlement goes back perhaps 12,000 years. The structures Nathan and Reese had just descended into had been built, and occupied, and abandoned, and sealed beneath the advancing ice, all before our deepest ancestor had drawn its first breath in an African forest. We are, as a species, staggeringly young. We know this intellectually. We learn it in school, we read it in geology texts, we nod at the figures in documentary films. We do not, most of us, feel it. Not as a physical thing, not as a weight. Nathan Pickman felt it, standing on the ice in September 1992, and I could see it in his face on the playback. And I felt it too, watching him, and I have felt it every morning since, in the particular way, you feel a thing that has permanently rearranged the furniture. They went back down the next day, all four of them this time, Hargreaves included. They were down for 8 hours, and from the footage Reese took on her camera, and Nathan's journal entries, and the partially coherent commentary Bill recorded over various sections of tape, I could piece together what they found. A city, not metaphorically a city, teat. Not a collection of natural formations that resembled structures if you were predisposed to see them. An actual urban complex of considerable scale, constructed of a stone that showed no weathering despite its age. A fact Nathan flagged as deeply significant in his journal, underlining it twice and adding 3 question marks in the margin. The absence of weathering was impossible. Stone weathers. Stone always weathers, given sufficient time and the presence of any moisture or temperature variation. The fact that this stone had not weathered suggested either a material science beyond anything in human current knowledge, or an environment so perfectly sealed and stable that the ordinary processes of entropy had simply been unable to get purchase. The architecture was non-human in its proportions, but internally consistent, as if the builders had their own logic of space and had applied it rigorously across every structure Nathan could see. Corridors sized for something broader and taller than a person, ceiling heights that suggested movement, not quite like ours. Something lower to the ground, perhaps, or something that moved with a different verticality, or something that didn't move through corridors the way we do, but was simply large enough that the ceilings were built to accommodate it. Chambers of varying sizes, openings that were not quite doorways, not quite arches, something in between, with a geometry that Reese described on camera as intentional in a way I can't decode yet. A phrase that I found, watching her say it, to be the most useful thing anyone said in 11 tapes of footage. She would decode it later. She was working toward it. She would not have enough time, but she was working toward it. There were carvings, extensive ones, covering walls from floor to ceiling, executed in a relief style that Reese described as narrative. Not decorative, not symbolic, in the abstract sense we associate with early human cave marking, but sequential, telling a story, telling many stories. She filmed as much of it as she could, moving the camera slowly along the walls while Nathan walked beside her with his torch and his journal. The footage has a quality I can only describe as reverent. Not because Reese was a reverent person, she wasn't. She was practical and methodical, but because she was moving at the pace that the material demanded, and the material demanded that you look at it carefully. The carvings showed creatures. The builders, presumably. They were not humanoid, in the way science fiction had always depicted alien life. They were radially symmetrical in their basic organization. A central body mass, 5 limbs extending from it, each limb capable of serving as either a support for locomotion or a manipulator for work. Their apex, the top of the body, by convention, since top was somewhat arbitrary for a creature of this configuration, carried the sensory cluster. They had no head in our sense. They had a concentration of sensing organs that could orient in any direction without the creature having to turn. This was in the carvings, and it would be confirmed later, and I will get to that. The carving record depicted them engaged in activities that Nathan could parse as recognizable functions. The construction of structures, the cultivation of something that might have been agriculture, what appeared to be astronomical observation, using instruments of considerable sophistication, and what appeared to be conflict, the only sequence in the entire carving record where the imagery became difficult to look at, not because of gore, but because of scale. Whatever they had warred against or warred amongst themselves about had been resolved long before the city was sealed. The record showed it resolved, the record moved on. And then, in several sequences that Nathan circled in his journal, and that Reese spent extra time on with the camera, there were smaller figures. Bipedal figures, upright, bilaterally symmetrical, small, in the carving record. in the way that things are depicted small when the carver wants to indicate their comparative insignificance. Pedal, with 2 arms and 2 legs, and a clearly differentiated head. No ambiguity of interpretation. Once you'd looked at enough of the carving record to understand its visual grammar. These were things that walked upright and had heads, and were small. Reese had stared at one of the panels for a long time on the tape. Not speaking, the camera pointed steadily at the wall, and I understood why. There is a moment when the implication of what you're seeing becomes unavoidable, and the moment takes a certain amount of time to absorb, and you stand in front of the wall and let it take its time. Bill started. "We don't know," Nathan said quickly on camera. His voice was tight. "Nathan, those look like—" "We don't know," Nathan said again, and his voice had the clipped certainty of a man who needs something to still be uncertain for one more day, because making it certain will change every sentence he ever writes for the rest of his life. They came back up that evening and the camp was quiet in a specific way. The quiet of people who have too much to process to fill silence with noise. Not the companionable quiet of a team that has done a good day's work, the other kind. Quiet of people whose internal vocabulary has just been substantially revised, and who have not yet built the new sentences. Hargreaves had gone quiet first, and stayed quiet all evening, answering questions with single words and staring at the camp table during dinner. Bill was talking too much, filling the silence with commentary that became increasingly disconnected as the evening went on. Fragments of ideas, half-finished sentences, the verbal equivalent of a man pacing a room. Cooked dinner, with the methodical efficiency of someone who is using the task to keep her mind occupied on something manageable. Nathan wrote in his journal for 3 hours without stopping, and then sat staring at the wall of his tent. I could see the wall he was staring at on Bill's footage. Bill had left the camcorder running on the camp table, ostensibly for ambient documentation, actually, I suspect, because he didn't know how to turn it off politely. Nathan sat in the frame, pen set down, journal closed on his lap, and stared at a point in the fabric of the tent about 40 centimeters in front of his face. He did this for a long time. Then he opened the journal again and wrote for another hour. In the morning, Hargreaves was gone. Not gone from the camp, gone from his tent. His sleeping bag was there. His boots were there. His coat was hanging on its hook. He was not. Nathan recorded in his journal with clinical precision, and noted that they had searched for 2 hours before accepting that the search would not be productive. There were no tracks in the snow around the camp that corresponded to an unbooted man leaving in any direction. There was no indication of how or where. He was simply no longer present, in the way that things in that place were sometimes simply no longer present. As if the logic of absence operated by different rules down there. I've thought about Hargreaves a great deal. The one who left no explanation. The one the footage didn't account for. I think he went back down. I think he went back in the night. Alone, without telling anyone. Without a rope line that the others knew about, because he needed to see it again, and he didn't want to wait for morning, and he didn't want to explain himself. That's the thing about genuine curiosity. It is not always cautious. It does not always pause at the door to weigh risk against reward in the measured way that competent adults are supposed to. Sometimes it simply moves. Sometimes it walks you through doors you haven't finished evaluating, because the alternative, standing outside in the dark while the thing you need to know is just below your feet, is a particular kind of unbearable. On the 8th day, Nathan and Reese went back down, and something was there. I watched this tape 4 times before I could hold it in my memory in a way that felt stable. Reese had the camera. Nathan had a torch, and the journal wedged under his arm, the way he always carried it down there, close, protected, like a thing that might be needed in a hurry. He descended through the fissure with the ease of familiarity. They knew the rope. They knew the transition point where the ice gave way to the stone passage. They knew how the cold changed quality as you went from ice cold to the older cold of the sealed city below. They went to the section of the city where the carvings were. They had a plan. Reese would film systematically while Nathan sketched and transcribed. They would document the entire narrative sequence. They would be the first human beings to understand what another form of intelligence had left behind. Not for us, that was clear. It hadn't been left for us, They hadn't known we were coming. No one builds a record for an audience that won't exist for another 40-odd million years. But what another form of intelligence had recorded about its own existence and its own world. Working for about 40 minutes, when Reese turned the camera toward a corridor they hadn't entered before. And in the darkness at the far end of it, there was something. I've tried to describe this in a way that is accurate, and I keep coming up short. So I'll tell you what the camera showed, and tell you what I interpreted from it, and you can draw your own conclusions. The creature was approximately 3 meters tall. It was bilaterally radially symmetrical in the way the carvings had suggested. A central body mass. Substantial, with 5 primary limbs extending from it, each limb terminating in structures that were clearly manipulators. Not hands, not claws, but something in between that clearly served functions similar to both. Its skin, if skin is the right word, and it may not be, had a texture that the camera rendered as dark and slightly iridescent. The way certain deep-sea creatures have a quality of light that comes from within rather than being reflected from without. The apex cluster of sensory organs was moving, orienting, tracking. It was clear from the footage, observe in every direction simultaneously, and had been aware of Reese and Nathan for some time before Reese turned the camera. It made a sound, not a vocalization, or not one that the camera's microphone could capture cleanly, but something that registered as a vibration, a pressure change in the air, a sound felt in the chest before it was processed as sound at all. Nathan described it that evening in his journal as contemptuous. I don't know if he was right. I don't know if contempt is a thing that creature could feel, or whether what it felt mapped to anything our emotional vocabulary could reach. But I know what I saw in the footage. It was entirely unbothered, not aggressive, not defensive, not alarmed in any way by the presence of 2 small, upright animals with a torch and a camera in its city. It regarded them the way you might regard a pigeon that has walked through your front door, with a kind of mild, slightly irritated patience. A creature that has seen this type of situation before and knows it will resolve itself. The apex cluster oriented toward them and held there, and in the body language of the creature, the specific stillness of it, the absolute absence of urgency. The implication was clear even through the footage, even to me watching it alone in a freezing camp. It had seen things like us before. It had seen things like us, and had assessed them, and had filed them away, and had waited them out. It had been here when we were not yet a thought in the universe's mind. And it had been here while we built our fires and our cities and our universities and our Antarctic expeditions. And it was still here. And we were still small. And nothing about us was surprising to it. Nothing about us required a change in posture. That was the insult, you see, not hostility, indifference, the casual assurance of something so ancient that our entire civilization registered as a brief noise. Civilizations come and go. The pattern holds. The pattern has held. Whatever we were just the latest entry in a very long record of things that had come and gone. Reese held the camera on it for 3 minutes. I timed it, on the playback, because it seemed important to know exactly how long. 3 minutes of footage of a creature, 3 meters tall, that had no biological reason to be alive, and every evidential reason to be alive. Standing in a corridor of its own sitsai and waiting for 2 small mammals to finish looking at it. 3 minutes. And at no point in those 3 minutes did it move to threaten them, or move to engage them, or do anything other than observe with the calm certainty of something that knows it has all the time available. Nathan backed toward the fissure slowly. Reese kept the camera running and backed with him. The creature watched them go. Nathan wrote in the journal that night that it had looked at them the way its musea curator looks at a school group that has wandered into the wrong gallery. Tolerated, assessed as no threat, expected to leave on their own once the novelty wore off. He wrote this, and then sat for a while with the pen in his hand and then added, in smaller writing beneath, "But we weren't a threat. Why would it expect us to leave? What has it seen of us, down here, that it's assessed as harmless and temporary?" He didn't answer his own question. Perhaps he couldn't, that night. The journal moved on to meticulous notes about the creature's observed morphology, the limb articulation, the apex cluster, the dimensions he'd estimated by comparison to the corridor width, and then stopped. He had been a scientist until the end. That is worth saying plainly. Nathan and Reese went back down the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. Lee. I understand this decision in a way that I could not explain to the university liaison. I understand it because I am the same kind of person. At the bottom of it, beneath the drilling certifications and the commercial contracts and the weathered reputation for practicality. I am curious. Nathan and Reese were looking at the most significant discovery in the history of human knowledge, and they went back down because the alternative was to not know, and not knowing is a particular kind of intolerable that certain people carry in them like a low-grade fever all their lives. And those are the people who end up in Antarctic camps in September. They had decoded more of the carving record. Decoded is generous, inferred is more honest, and Nathan would have been the first to say so. But they had been working at it for days, building a provisional vocabulary of forms and positions and sequences that recurred in consistent contexts. The way you build a vocabulary for any language you don't share. By finding the points of contact, the moments where meaning is clear enough to anchor everything else to. Reese had noticed that certain postures in the carved figures correlated with certain types of events. The formal assembly posture always preceded significant collective decisions. The outward orientation posture. All apex clusters pointed away from the group appeared when the builders were making observations of their environment. The inward orientation appeared during deliberation, during the formal examination of something that needed to be assessed. She had built a lexicon of 8 postures with reasonable confidence and 20 more with conditional confidence, and Nathan had built on this to develop preliminary readings of the narrative sequences. It was, given 10 days and 2 people and no prior scholarship to draw on, a remarkable achievement. I am aware that it sounds like I'm speaking highly of the dead, and I am, but I am also speaking accurately. They had the broad shape of the story the carvings told. The builders had been here for a very long time, longer than any human framework has words to accommodate. They had built their city when Antarctica was not Antarctica, when the continent sat further north and was warm, and life was different. And the builders were different too, perhaps, in the early panels of the record. They had adapted to the cold as the continent drifted south over geological time. They had eventually sealed the city and departed. Somewhere. The carvings didn't specify where, didn't specify why, in the way that the carvings didn't specify anything that the builders had considered so fundamental to their knowledge that it needed no statement. The city was not abandoned in the way a human city is abandoned, the way a thing is left when the people who made it can no longer maintain it. It was sealed the way you seal a house when you are going somewhere for a season, with the expectation of return, and they had returned. The creature in the corridor was evidence of that. The city had been reopened. The occupants were back. The small bipedal figures appeared in the later sections of the carving record. In the early sections, they were absent because in the early sections, nothing like us existed on this planet. The carving record was old enough that it covered the era before us entirely, when the world belonged to other things that no longer exist. By the time we appeared, crude, barely differentiated, small in the carvings in the way that things are depicted small, when the carver wants to indicate their comparative insignificance. The builders were already counting their age in epochs that our calendar years couldn't contain. The carvings showed them regarding us, showed them making assessments, the formal grouped posture of deliberation, the apex clusters all oriented inward to a common point, the gestural register that Reese had come to read as formal attention, showed them, as Nathan put it, filing us away, finding us unremarkable, a new noise in a world that had made noises before. There was a sequence that Nathan circled 3 times in his journal and wrote next to, in capital letters, "This is the one." A panel of carvings showing the builders in formal assembly, all of them facing inward, apex sensory clusters all oriented to a central point, where a bipedal figure, a human figure, or something near enough that the distinction didn't matter, stood small and clearly being examined. And around the assembled builders, in the visual language of the carving record that Nathan and Reese had spent days building a provisional vocabulary for, there was an expression that Nathan had decoded as laughter. as the formal notation of something small and confused and unthreatening being paraded before an assembly that found its smallness amusing in a specific way, the amusement of certainty. Not malicious amusement, not cruelty. Just the calm confidence of creatures so ancient that novelty had become almost impossible. And here was something novel. This small, persistent, curious thing. And in the next panel, the human figure was gone. And the builders had returned to their business. And the record moved on. That was the last entry in Nathan's journal. He and Reese went down on the 10th day and did not come back. Bill filmed the fissure entrance for 3 hours with the camera propped on a tripod, pointed at the hole they'd descended into, and nothing emerged. He called down the rope twice. He got no answer. He tried a third time, putting his head close to the fissure, and thought he heard something. A vibration, he said, in his recorded commentary, that he felt in his back teeth more than heard. And he pulled his head back quickly and sat in the snow for a while with the camera running beside him, and then picked it up and went back to camp. Bill's last tape was recorded in the camp. Sometime in the night, he'd made tea. He sat in front of the camera and talked for 40 minutes in the way that people talk when they need to hear their own reasoning, said out loud to know if it holds together. Most of it was fragmented in the way that extreme stress fragments speech. But it was not the raving of a broken mind. Bill was not broken. He was working. They've been here the whole time, he said. The whole time. While we were. Everything. Everything we did. Building things, mapping things, naming things, writing everything down. All that time. They've been here, and they knew, and they just... He stopped, drank his tea. They just didn't care. That's what I keep coming back to. I don't think we ever seemed dangerous to them. Or significant. We just seemed. We seemed like something that was happening. Like weather. He was quiet for a while. Nathan was terrified of that, he said. Not of them. Of being nothing to them. I could see it in him down there. He didn't. Nathan would have been fine if they were hostile. If they had wanted us gone. At least that means we registered. At least that means we were worth removing. He looked at the camera. Being nothing to them. That was what got into him. That was what got into Reese too, I think, underneath the science. Underneath all the filming, and the transcribing, and the careful language. They needed to matter, and we didn't, and that. He shook his head. That's a hard thing to absorb. That's a harder thing to absorb than anything else down there. The scale of the buildings, the age of the carvings, the thing in the corridor. Those are hard things, but they're things you can file. You can put them in categories and process them over time. But the idea that we were looked at, directly looked at, by something 50 million years more experienced than us, and we were found. He stopped, looked away, looked back, found amusing, and then dismissed. That's the one that gets into you. He picked up the camera and carried it outside, and the last 20 minutes of the tape was the Antarctic sky. Just the sky. The stars at that latitude are not the stars you see from anywhere inhabited. And they looked different on the small playback screen. More present, more numerous, more cold. Bill's breathing was audible. The tape ran out. I sat in the camp for another hour after the last tape finished, with my tea mug empty and the stove ticking in the cold. And I thought about what I had watched over 3 days and what I was going to carry out of there. And then I thought about the carvings. Specifically, I thought about Nathan's This Is the One panel, the assembly, the small human figure at the center. The posture Nathan had decoded as amusement. And I thought about a thing that Nathan had had in front of him. And that grief and the weight of that place had prevented him from seeing clearly. Or perhaps that he had seen, and the thought had been overwhelmed before it could finish forming. The carvings showed a formal assembly. You don't call an assembly, you don't convene, you don't gather your kind and orient your collective attention to a central point. About something that genuinely doesn't concern you. You don't hold formal deliberations about weather. You don't carve, in your permanent record, in the narrative sequence of your civilization's history, the moment you assessed a species that was truly beneath your notice. Carving itself was evidence of noticing. The assembly was evidence of noticing. Something about us, some specific quality, some behavior or pattern, had warranted a formal response. And the carving record showed us persisting, showed us in the early panels as small and crude, and showed us still present in later panels. Still small, still crude by the builder's standard, but present. Consistently present. The other species that had come and gone in the long record of the planet's life were in the early panels and absent from the later ones. We were in the early panels and still there, still making noise, and we had found the city. We had found it by drilling down into an anomaly that most expeditions would have noted and moved on from. Because the survey plan called for ice core samples and not for investigating geological irregularities that were expensive and time-consuming to pursue. Nathan had pursued it. Reese had found the hollow space with equipment she hadn't been specifically sent to use for that purpose. Because she was thorough and curiosity drove her to check everything her instruments could check. They had found the fissure. They had gone down. We had found the city because we were curious. Because we pursued anomalies. Because not knowing things is for certain kinds of people genuinely intolerable. Because we had evolved. Out of millions of years of being small and slow and outmatched by the predators around us. A compensating trait. The drive to understand our environment so thoroughly that we could predict and outwit and eventually master it. Not through size or speed or armament, but through accumulated knowledge. Through documentation. Through the systematic collection and preservation of everything we could observe. The builders had convened their assembly and found us amusing. I was sitting in that camp having 11 tapes made by 4 people who had documented more about the builders in 10 days than the builders had. Apparently expected could be documented by a species of our apparent capability. Nathan's journal was a primary source analysis of an alien civilization's own self-recorded history, constructed by a man with a torch and a willingness to look at things carefully. Reese's camera footage was an archive. The core samples were physical evidence. I packed 11 tapes. Packed Nathan's journal. I packed Reese's printed stills and her camera. I packed Bill's camcorder. Packed the core samples. I packed everything that could be packed. Then I went to the fissure. Want to be precise about what I was doing and what I was not doing. I was not being brave. I was being practical. I had a rope and a good torch, and I had watched 11 tapes of footage of the layout of the upper section of the city, and I knew the route to the carving corridor. And there was one section of the carving record that Nathan had noted but had not reached before the expedition ended. A section immediately before the "This is the one" panel. A section he had intended to document on the day he had not come back. I needed to see it. That's the most honest thing I can say. I needed to see what came before the assembly panel. What had the builders seen, or done, or documented, in the sequence that led them to convene and look at the small bipedal thing at the center of their gathering. I went down in 16 minutes. The city was cold and enormous and silent in the way that places are silent when the silence is not an absence of sound but a presence. Something that occupies the air the way water occupies a vessel, filling all the available space. My torch reached well, and the route was exactly as the footage had shown it, and I walked quickly. I want to tell you what it was like, walking through that city, because I think it matters, and because no one has asked me the question directly, and I have never volunteered it. The university man wanted logistics, and the 3 a.m. darkness wanted Ab's solution. And neither of them asked what it felt like to walk through rooms that were built 50 million years ago by something that was not human, and is still not human, and is still, presumably, somewhere in the ice below. It felt like being wrong about something very large that you had never known you were wrong about. Not frightening, or not primarily frightening. More like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and realize the ceiling is much higher than you thought. A recalibration of scale, a sudden awareness that the space you occupy is a much smaller fraction of the available space than you had assumed. Corridors were not threatening. They were simply built for something other than me. And the difference between a space built for me and a space not built for me is not comfort versus discomfort. It is the difference between a world that includes me and a world that predates me so thoroughly that inclusion hadn't occurred to anyone. I am not a man who is prone to philosophical distress. I have worked in dangerous places and seen things go wrong and dealt with them practically, because the alternative is to not deal with them, which is worse. But walking through that city, I understood something about Nathan's face on the tape the specific quality of the recalibration he'd been doing, in a way that no amount of watching footage had prepared me for. You have to stand in the space. You have to let the scale of it press against you directly. I let it press for about 30 seconds. Then I moved toward the carving corridor, because I had come for a reason. Carving corridor. The section Nathan had not reached. I photographed it with Reese's camera, working methodically along the wall, keeping my breathing steady, keeping the camera steady, the way you keep things steady on a rig when the situation is what it is, and steadiness is all you have to offer. Carving that Nathan had not reached, the panel immediately before the assembly sequence, showed a transition. The builders in a posture of attention, not alarm, not the formal assembly stance, but a directed orientation. All their apex clusters pointed outward toward the edges of the panel, and in the corners of the panel, almost marginal, almost incidental. As if the carver had noted it the way you note a detail that is interesting but not yet understood. There were tracks, small tracks, bipedal, moving in a pattern that was organized in a way that natural movement is not. Grid-patterned, systematic, survey tracks. Thing had been surveying the ground above the city in a methodical pattern that the builders had noticed and found worth recording. The small bipedal things had not stumbled in randomly. They had been working a grid. They had been mapping, systematically, in the way that creatures with limited sensory range compensate for what they cannot perceive directly. By covering the ground, by walking every section of it, by noting what they found. The patterns above the city was the pattern of something that was trying to understand what was beneath it. The builders had noticed this, had found it interesting enough to record, had then convened to look at one of these creatures up close, had found the creature small and amusing, and had dismissed it. And then, and this was in the subsequent panels, which I photographed as quickly as my hands could work, had left, parted the city again, had sealed it, as if having assessed us and filed us and moved on. They had had no further need to stay. They had found us curious and amusing. Curious little creatures, making their curious little surveys. In the way that curious little creatures do. I was in that corridor for 2 hours. I photographed every panel I could reach. When the camera battery died, I stood in the darkness for 3 minutes with my torch. And I looked at the carvings in the torchlight. And I thought about Nathan's face on the playback, and about Bill talking to the stars. I thought about the fact that those builders had looked at the survey tracks above their city, and had assessed the creature that made them, had held their formal assembly, and looked at one of us up close, and had concluded that what they were seeing was quaint, that the curiosity was a novelty, that the small persistent things with their organized patterns were at best briefly interesting and then dismissible. They had made that assessment, and they had left. And while they were gone, the curiosity they had found quaint had kept going. The survey tracks had become settlements. The settlements had become cities. The cities had built universities and sent expeditions, and the expeditions had drilled into ice on a frozen continent and followed an anomaly down. And 2 people with torches and a camera had spent 10 days in the Semps Hall itself, photographing the walls, building a vocabulary for the language of the record, decoding the broad shape of a civilization's self-history. And a practical man with a geology certificate had come in behind them and photographed the rest. The builders had found our curiosity amusing. I found it, standing in their corridor with a dead camera and a working torch, to be the most reliable thing about us, the one quality I would bet on. I came up the rope in under 10 minutes. I repacked everything with the efficiency of a man who has packed equipment in cold conditions, more times than he can count, and I started the snowcat back across the ice. I'm going to tell you something I didn't tell the university man, because I didn't fully understand it when we spoke, and I understand it better now. Nathan had needed to matter to them. He had needed the creature in the corridor to look at him and see something worth acknowledging. He had needed the assembly panel to show something other than dismissal. I understand that need. I felt the pull of it in that corridor, in the cold, with the carvings all around me, and the silence of 50 million years pressing down, the urge to be significant, to be seen, stand in the assembly chamber, and have the creatures at the center of that panel look at you and think, this one is different. This one is worth something more than a carving in the record. I understand it, and I think it was the wrong thing to want. Not because significance doesn't matter. It does. Every human being who has ever done anything worth doing has needed, at some level, to believe that the doing of it mattered. Nathan mattered. Reese mattered. The 10 days they spent in that city, building a vocabulary for a language that no human being had ever encountered, mattered more than most work done by most people in most decades of recorded history. They needed the builders to confer the significance, and the builders weren't going to do that. And the need became a weight that the city pressed down on until it was crushing. The significance was never theirs to give. It was always ours to earn, in the slow grinding way we earn everything. By continuing, by documenting, by coming back. That is what I carried out of the ice. Not triumph, not closure. Not the kind of resolution that the ending of a story is supposed to provide, where the thing that happened is contained and comprehensible, and you can put it behind you and get on with your days. The lockbox is under the floor, and the days continue and I get on with them. But the thing that happened is not behind me. It is present in the way that fundamental changes in understanding are always present. Built into the walls of how you think, not added on top. I am 54 years old. I've worked 3 continents and drilled in conditions that would kill a man who wasn't paying attention, and I've seen what cold and isolation and the particular silence of empty places do to people who aren't ready for them. I thought I knew what I was ready for. I was wrong about the scale of it, and knowing I was wrong about the scale of it is the permanent thing I brought back from the ice. More than the tapes, more than the photographs, more than the journal. The scale of what was down there, and the scale of what we'd already done in the face of it, without knowing it was being watched. Nathan is gone. Reese is gone. Hargreaves is not accounted for, and I have made my peace with not being able to account for him. Bill's last image is the Antarctic sky, which is a terrible last image for a man who was cheerful and who wanted to be famous and who kept the camera running because he was making a documentary. But the tapes are in the lockbox. The journal is in the lockbox. The photographs are in the lockbox. Core samples are cataloged and stored. Everything that could be preserved was preserved, because that is what we do. We observe, we map, we note, we document. We preserve. We keep doing it regardless of whether anything older or larger or more experienced is watching and finding us quaint. We keep doing it because the alternative is to stop, and stopping is not something we are built for. Somewhere under the Antarctic ice, in the silence of a city older than our genus, there is a carved panel of a formal assembly, regarding a small bipedal figure with the expression Nathan decoded as contempt. And in a fireproof lockbox in Leeds, there are 11 videotapes, and a green hardback journal, and a dead camera, and 214 photographs of the walls of that assembly hall. We were already mapping when they started watching. We are still mapping now.